I want you to imagine with me that I have a time machine. Maybe that's why you're here. You heard that the new pastor had a time machine. That was a lie. Somebody tricked you into coming here. But imagine with me that I have a time machine and we are going back to 2009. I know what you're thinking. Great year. 2009, if you don't know why we're going back because that was the year that Bitcoin started. And so I'm like, hey, we're not going to be there super long, but you and we're going to go back and I'm going to allow you to bring whatever you want with you. And we're going to invest it in Bitcoin, go back in our time machine, come back to now, and we're going to see what happens. What would you bring? Everything, right? You'd be like, hey, listen, I'm going to sell all my land. I'm going to sell all my property. I'm going to sell all my things, everything. I'm going to liquidate all assets. I'm going to get as much money as possible. I'm going to take out as many loans as the bank would allow me to take because, who even cares about credit at that point? We're just like, hey, I just need as much money as possible. Why? Because we're going to invest everything we can into this thing that we know, we believe is going to have an incredible return. We'd give everything. And yet, when it comes to the promises of God, God makes a ton of promises, not just for our life, but for our eternity. And he tells us what it looks like to live out our faith as disciples. And yet for most of us, we'd be far more willing to invest far more in Bitcoin than we would in his promises. Now, if you're starting to have heart palpitations because you're like, hey, this guy's first message is on tithing, giving, and generosity, don't worry. That's not the focus of this message. You're all right. Everybody be cool. But the focus of this message is where we are placing our attention and where we're willing to sacrifice most often. And that usually lends towards where our vision is gazing upon. Here's what I mean. Let me show you. This is a rope. I know it's man, this is crazy. This is mind-blowing. This is a rope, but I want you to imagine one last time with me that this rope, it goes on forever. It doesn't. It's just kind of coiled up over there, but just imagine with me that it goes on forever. And this rope also represents your existence. And this blue part, this is your time here on earth. We've just got a little bit of time and then everything else. And for most of us, we're just so caught up in this blue part, we're just so caught up in, if I just work right here, sure, I'm not going to see my family, I'm not going to see friends, I'm not going to be caught up in biblical community, but if I work here, at this end of the blue part, I'm going to have everything I wanted. I'm going to have that honeymoon that I always promised we'd do, but we never did. I'm going to get that house that I always wanted. I'm going to be able to buy all those things. If I just do these things over here, this is going to be great, and we forget about all the rest of the rope. Y'all, there's a point in our existence where we're going to stand before the Creator and we're going to be held accountable for the way we lived our lives. That's not a heaven and hell conversation. That's standing before our Creator, talking about how we lived our lives. And what I don't want is I don't want him to say, man, you were so willing to invest your time, your talents, your money, everything that you had. You were going to give it all to Bitcoin. And you were willing to withhold so much more from my kingdom and who I called you to be. See, it's really easy to focus on the blue part because it's visible and it's in front of us and it's easy. But it's a lot more important for us to look far past that to what is next. See, we're meant to live in the now with eyes on eternity. We're meant to live in the present, right? It's not hey, we just sit down and we do nothing. We're meant to live here as a response to what comes later because the promises in that book are far greater than something that is not going to last, that moths and rust are going to make decay and thieves can steal. They can do that here, but in heaven, in eternity, God has something better for us. It's not a depreciating asset. If you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to James chapter 5 as we unpack what it looks like to place our eyes on eternity. And while you get there, you might not know me. I'm Josh. I'm the lead pastor here at 180 Life Church. And whether you are here for the first time or maybe you come here many times, I just want to say welcome. I'm glad you're here. And we have been in a series called Act Like You Believe. And what it's really talking about, it's not talking about acting like you believe. It's talking about activating our faith in such a way that we can't help but behave in response to our belief. And in order to unpack that, we've been in the book of James, and I'm using we very liberally because I'm new here. It's fine. But we've been unpacking this idea through the book of James, and James has something for us as we figure out what to do with our eyes and where you and I are meant to place our focus. James 5, verse 7, it starts like this. It says, "Be patient then brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. And I love this because he's right out of the gate. He's like, hey, be patient. Why? Because the Lord's coming. Like, hey, we need to keep our eyes where they belong, and it's not in the now. He's saying, hey, we're waiting in the now. What for? The Lord is coming. We need our eyes on eternity. This is not about the blue part. And that idea of being patient is really, really important for us because we're being patient with a purpose. See, once he comes, we don't need to be patient anymore. He's who we've been waiting for. Like, Jesus is going to return, and everything that we do is meant to be a response to knowing that information. It's meant to be a response to that belief. If we act like we believe, if we activate our faith in such a way, we're not living for the blue part anymore. There's a lot more rope that you and I are focused upon. And this idea that he's talking about, he says, be patient then. And that word then is a word you probably know. Like, I know you're kind of giving us some profound information. But that word then is talking about what was stated prior. And so we have to look back a little bit. If you were here last week, you heard Dave kind of speak to it. And it was this idea where James is kind of delineating these two different types of people. He says brothers and sisters, and he's talking about believers. And so if you have placed your faith in Jesus, he's saying, hey, brothers and sisters, like this is what we're talking about. This is what we need to do. We need to be patient. But he also, earlier in this chapter, highlights different people. And he says, hey, you wealthy, you with lots of money, you doing really well. Now, to be clear, he's not saying that just because you have money, you're not a brother and sister. That's not what he's saying. What he's doing is he's highlighting people who are living for the blue part of the rope. Here's how you know. If you look back in chapter 5, at the very beginning, he says they are like fattened pigs, like they're fattening themselves for slaughter. They're living for now. They're living not for the end of the rope. They're not living for eternity. They're living for the now. And he said, hey, you are completely missing it. And that's really important for us as we be patient, brothers and sisters. Here's why. Because it's so easy. I don't know if you've done this. I've done this. Where I look at the lives of other people and I just say, man, they've just got it so easy. You know? Like you look and you're like, man, like God, like I'm trying to be faithful over here. Like I'm trying to do my part. Like I'm trying to like live out my faith. And it's hard. Like there's things that are just not going my way. Like we suffer, we go through trials and tribulation. The book of James is really kind of about that. That's a major theme in the book of James is suffering. Then we look at our suffering and then we look at their Instagram feed and man, their marriage is perfect. They never argue and their kids always listen. We look at the Instagram feed, we look at the highlights, we look at other people's lives, and we say, God, like they're unfaithful. Why are they having it so good? For you and me, we got to remember, listen, one, stop judging other people. Bill already talked about it. But the other piece is you and I, we've got a responsibility to stop living for the blue part of the rope. He's saying, hey, we need to be patient because something well worth the return is coming. And it might not be in this life. This is not prosperity gospel. This is not saying, hey, just because you do good now means you'll get good later on in your life. This is saying, hey, like we're meant to invest in the kingdom in such a way that we're investing in our eternity. And so I'm here to tell you, because I care about you. I know we just met. I know this is new. But I care enough about you, I'm just going to pull the Band-Aid right off. If you are a disciple of Christ, suffering isn't a glitch. It's a feature. Like, it's not a surprise. It's not like, hey, I can't believe this happened. Like, this is just a huge surprise to me. No. Like, suffering is a part of the plan. Like, being a disciple, we are going to suffer. That is just a part of it. When Paul was called on the road to Damascus, Jesus had a conversation with another disciple named Ananias. He said, hey, I'm going to show Paul how much he needs to suffer for my name. Look at the lives of the disciples. They suffered. Look at James. He suffered. And still, it's worth it. The whole point of the book is in our suffering. He's saying, hey, be patient because now really isn't all of it. There is so much more that you and I get to take part in as we keep our eyes towards eternity. My wife, Jenny, you might not know it, probably not. She has an autoimmune disease. And so that has led us into seasons that have been incredibly hard for us. Seasons where I've been frustrated, seasons where I've even been mad at God, where I'm like, God, like, why is this happening in our lives? This doesn't feel right or fair. It's frustrating. And Jenny had a friend who told her something that I will never forget. She said, this is our only chance to suffer for Jesus. Like, there's going to be a point where you and I, we're standing before our Creator, and He's going to wipe away every tear. And it's in this moment where you and I, we have a chance to suffer for the King. And it shouldn't be a surprise because He suffered for us. The question is, where are your eyes? Because that's the difference between being grateful as we suffer. That doesn't mean you don't mourn, doesn't mean it's not difficult, doesn't mean you don't grieve, but we're able to keep eyes on what's most important. Or do we become grumblers and become frustrated? James continues, he says, see how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm because the Lord's coming is near. He's like, hey, just in case you forgot, we're waiting for the Lord to come. Like, that's the most important piece of this. Like, that's what we're really focused on. But in the waiting, that's not a passive process. Think about it. If a farmer just waits for the rain to come and does nothing, he's not a farmer. He's just a guy who sits on the couch and watches football. Like, in order to be a farmer, what do you have to do? You have to farm, right? Like, you have to actually plant the seed and prepare the soil, all the things that I don't even know how to do. But a farmer would. It's an active, action-based process where we have to have an activated faith, where we're living out our faith in such a way that it looks like we believe because we actually do. And for the purpose of what? Having a valuable crop. Like that's what the waiting is a part of. It's an action-based process where we are producing and working on a valuable crop. And what is valuable to the Lord? Like, that's what we really got to ask ourselves is like, what is the crop that I'm trying to produce? And I want each of us to ask, what is the product of your life? What part of the rope are you focused on? Is it something that will last or something that's not going to make it? What is the valuable crop that you are working towards? Is it your wealth, your reputation, your status, your success, the success of your kids? Is it about you? Is it me-centric like we like to believe it is? Or is it about producing something different? Some of you might have a biblical answer. You might be like, hey, yeah, isn't like the valuable crop that we were trying to produce, this feels like it meshes really well with some of the things that Ephesians talks about, right? Where it's talking about like, hey, fruit of the Spirit. Like, it's talking about like, hey, like I'm meant to bear like fruit for creation. Like, I'm meant to bear it out for everyone to see. I'm meant to be a disciple who loves and lives like him. Is that the answer? Is it about peace, joy, long-suffering, patience? Is it about those fruit? I would say yes and no. Because you got to remember, fruit of the Spirit are not for you. Like, we're meant to live them out, don't get me wrong. Like, we're meant to be bearers of fruit. Like, people know us by seeing the fruit, like the same way they know what a tree is. And yet, it's not for you. Think about it. Your joy isn't just so that you're joyful. It's that others can experience your joy and say, what is wrong with that person? Why are they happy in such a broken world? It's where people see your long suffering, and it's not that you just white knuckle it and get through, but they see the long suffering and they say, how on earth are they still standing? Until they see a community of believers holding them up as Jesus holds them all up. Patience and peace. Let me tell you something. I have never struggled with offering patience to myself. It's never been a problem. But with you, with people, with relationship, it is hard. See, our fruit of the Spirit are meant to be the seeds for the crop. That's the point. Why? That we're producing disciples, that we are disciple makers living out the commission that Jesus gave us. That's the whole point. Paul says it this way. He says it in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. He says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? He's like, hey, like how do we measure our valuable crop? Well, is it, do we go on Google reviews? Like, do we go on Yelp? Do we try to, like, figure it out from there? Do we ask other people, like, hey, what was your experience? He says, no, that's not quite it. You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of the human heart. He's saying, it's not about what people say. It's about the life change that they experience. He's saying the validity of my ministry is look at the disciples that are being transformed and turning this world upside down. They're reproducing the fruit that they've experienced it, and look at the valuable crop that they make. It's about making disciples. He's saying, hey, look out all over there and see what God is doing. I think that's important for us because we need to recognize it's so easy, especially in today's culture, for it just to be about me. And I just receive and I receive and I receive, and church is about me and everything's about me and work is about me. And listen, I'm not sharing this as an indictment of anyone. I'm just getting to know everybody. But I know that for me, there's a gravity to this. And I need to be reminded that it's not about me. If the disciples lived out their mission that way, where it was all about them and they just bore fruit and they didn't reproduce and make valuable crops, guess what? We're not here and we don't have hope. It was because they lived on mission and they produced that crop of discipleship and they pressed into relationship and they invested not just in the blue part, but for the long part of the rope, that they lived out their faith in such a way with eyes on eternity that they could not help but produce a crop that was valuable and lasting and worthwhile. But we won't do that unless our eyes are on what really matters. It'll be a lot easier to invest in Bitcoin than to invest in the kingdom. I want to repeat the passage because it's really important. There's something that I want to drive home. It says, "See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains." And I think that last part is really important in there because the farmer is acknowledging, or James is acknowledging, that the farmer isn't the one doing the heavy lifting. Like the farmer is under no illusion that he is the one doing the hard work. Here's what I mean. He's not the one who makes it rain. He's not the one that brings down the spring and the fall rain. And there's a season in the middle of that called winter that you guys have mentioned. I think it's a myth still. It doesn't feel real. I'll let you know if I change my mind later on. But the farmer's waiting on the rain. Why? Because God is the one doing the heavy lifting. We had this pattern at home when my daughter was 3, where I don't know if she thought she was born in like Europe or something, but she would wake up at ungodly hours. And then she'd wake up, and so sometimes it would be my turn to get up, and so I would get up with her. And Lila and we would play this game where I would dress her up in the least matching clothes possible. Right? Like I'm not great at making things match, but I know when they really don't. And so we would get this like outfit together and she'd be all prepared, and then mom would finally wake up and we'd say, "Hey mom, like check Lila out. Look at her, isn't she beautiful?" And she'd twirl. And Jenny would grimace. And Lila would say something almost every time. It took a while to kind of work that out. And she'd say this phrase. She'd say, "Mom, I did it all myself." And I'd lean over and be like, "Hey baby, is that true?" "Oh, and Dad helped me." And I bring that up, and James brings this up for a very specific reason. Y'all, we came here, we uprooted our family because we genuinely believe God is about to do something in West Hartford. Like we genuinely believe that God is about to do something. And I believe that he's going to do it through this church. Like I really believe he's calling us up as disciples to live out this mission in our lives. And he's going to have us do some incredible things. This Connecticut state that is way smaller than Texas, he's going to flip it upside down. And it's going to be incredible. But here's the thing. And I bring this up now because it is so important. I don't ever want us to get to the point where we start beating our chest and say, "Look how good our church is. We are the best." Like, I don't want us to get to the point of, "Hey, look at all the things we did." Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. We have a part to play. We have things that we need to do. Remember, the waiting a farmer takes part in is meant to be an active process. And yet, I never want us to forget who's the one doing the heavy lifting. I don't want people to say, "Hey, like, what's going on with your church?" And us to say, "Man, like, look at what we are doing. It's incredible." "Oh, yeah, and Dad helped us." I want us to go first to him and say, "Look at how he is using us because he is doing a work. He is watering the fields. He is preparing the plants. He's the one that makes it grow." And we're the ones who get to take part in it. Like we get to live out our faith in such an extreme way, but we're not confused about who's the one doing the heavy lifting. He is the one who makes it rain. And when we recognize that part, that it is not us doing the heavy work, it's so much easier to be grateful and to not be entitled. So much easier to have a heart posture that is so just praised, like ready, that like I can't help but lift up my hands. Like I can't help but celebrate who he is and what he's done. And James, I think he addresses it here in verse 9. He says, "Don't grumble against one another." He says, "Brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. He can't help but just keep reminding us, like, hey, the Lord is coming. That J in judge is capital. Like, it's not just a judge. It's not Judge Joe Brown. It's the judge. He said, hey, he's standing at the door. Like, he is here, and we need to be ready. Don't grumble. And that idea of don't grumble, remember, like, you ever notice that gratitude and grumbling can't coexist? They can't. They're mutually exclusive. Like, you can only have a heart posture or one of the, you could fake it, but you can only really have a heart posture of one. And I'll tell you this, I have never had a heart of grumbling when I'm looking at the long part of the rope. Like, when I'm looking in through the lens of eternity and just saying, hey, like, man, like, this is just like temporal. Like, this is just for now. Like, this is not the end of the rope. This is not what I'm living for. I'm living for everything else. It's easy to be grateful. It's when I'm focused on the blue part that I tend to miss it. And y'all, I'm not sharing this as a, hey, like, you need to get right. This is a message for me. Like, as we've been going through the closing of our house, it has been a literal nightmare. It has been awful. And at the same time, I need to be reminded, I'm not living for the short part of the rope. I'm not living for the short things that don't last. I'm living to invest in the kingdom. And what that looks like is it looks like being the disciple he always called me to be. Because whether it's a storm, whether it's a valley, whether it's the wilderness, or whether it's the promised land, I am meant to be his. And if I'm living out of that, I think the world's ready to experience that kind of disciple. And that is the kind of disciple you and I were meant to be. But here's the challenge. Where the eyes go, the body follows. Like, wherever you're looking, that's going to drive where you're going and how you're behaving. Think about it, like a base runner. Like, if you hit the ball and you start running to first base, what do you tell them to look at? You don't say look at the ball. You say don't look at the ball. Hey, you need to look through first base. You need to look at the fence back there because that's where I want you to run. Why? Because as soon as I start looking, I start turning. Where the eyes go, the body follows. Y'all, we need to remember as disciples, as we live out this mission here on this earth, as we reproduce and make a valuable crop, as we lead out discipleship in the intentional way that God created us to, we need to check our eyes. Are we looking at now? Or are we living in now with eyes on eternity? Verse 10, it says, brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. He's saying, hey, those people who have persevered, aka they've been through suffering, been through the hard, we count them as blessed, which is confusing. Because we're like, hey, like, how does that make sense? Like, how does suffering equal a good thing? Well, Peter says it this way. He says, hey, your suffering is something worth more than gold refined by fire. Listen, most of us have prayed for gold. Have you ever prayed for suffering? That's not my, like, I'm not saying, hey, we just need to, like, pray that everything goes wrong. Like, that's not my prayer. But I am saying, like, we need to come to recognition that as we go through the hard, like, God is doing a work in us and through us, and we're not done, and he's not done with us. We have a part to play as disciples of Christ. What would it look like for us to live it out? And he goes a little further. He says, you have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. If you read the first 75% of Job, that idea of God being full of compassion and mercy is hard to hear, right? Because Job's life was tough. Like, Job had everything, and then he lost everything in a moment. I'm just going to read you the first couple, or some of the verses in Job, just so you know. A messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, a messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house. There were 10 of them. When suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house, it collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground and worshiped. Job had everything we want, minus AC. He had everything. Like, he had the family, he had the money. It says he was the greatest man in the East. Like, he had a lot. And in one moment, through 4 messengers, he lost almost all of it. I think for us, like, this, it can just be this moment where we're like, okay, God, like, how is this fair? Like, God, like, why are you doing this to me? Like, how could you allow this to happen? Because I deserve better. That's where we go. But in all of this, that wasn't Job's response. No, he tore his clothes and shaved his head, which was a response of humility, and then he got on the ground and he worshiped. Why? Because his eyes never left where they were always meant to be. They were always on his Creator. He was far more interested in who God is than what was going on in his life. He wasn't focused on the blue part of the rope. And that's hard. Listen, I'm not trying to minimize, so hear me. I know that there are people in this room that are going through incredibly difficult things. I'm not minimizing that or diminishing it. Like, I recognize that I don't know your story. You don't know my story yet. Like, it's something that we're going to have to walk through, but there's a reality to, like, it's not so much about the suffering that we're talking about. It's about where our eyes are in the midst of it. Where is your focus? We don't even hear Job ask the question why, which honestly, the question why isn't a bad thing. Why is not a sinful question when done through a contrite heart. In fact, we have a rule in our house that our kids are always allowed to ask the question why. Why? Because the why is what gives the what value. Now, they need to obey first, but they're allowed to ask why. This book is full of the answers to the question why. Why did Job worship? It's because he was reminded and remembered who God was. It's because his eyes didn't fall on the ground. And there's a gravity to our vision, y'all. Like, there's a gravity where I'm looking up at him and I'm nailing it, and then something bad happens in my life where I stub my toe and I get upset and things are just not what I want them to be. And all of a sudden my vision starts coming down to this earth and I focus on the blue part and what happens to my heart. I grumble, I get upset, I complain, and I forget that I'm meant to be a disciple. As I go through the hard, what does it look like to be reminded of whose I am? Finally, James says something that feels just out of left field. Like, if I'm honest, like, it just doesn't feel like it matches up with the rest of the chapter, and there's a reason for that. See, James would sometimes just kind of interject some thoughts, and the reason he would do it would be to emphasize what he's trying to say. And here's what he says. He says, above all, so he's like double emphasizing here, brothers and sisters, do not swear by heaven or by earth or anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no, otherwise you will be condemned. And that sounds really harsh, and it sounds like kind of out of left field, but we need to actually like recognize this is culturally, this is something that we take part in pretty often. It's like, hey, like, are you telling the truth? Yes, I swear to God. Or you do the end-all, be-all promise where you pull out your pinky and you latch it with somebody else's, right? That means I'm telling the truth. And what he's saying here, Jesus says in the book of Matthew, he's saying, hey, let your yes be yes and your no be no. If I have to swear to God in order to tell the truth, there's something wrong with my heart. And what I think is really, really special here is what happens if we flip it and look at why we lie. Because I have never lied when I'm looking at the long part of the rope. If I'm looking through the lens of eternity, there's no reason to lie. In fact, lying is a bad investment. But if I look at the short part of the rope, man, I'm worried about what's going to happen, right? Like, I'm worried about, hey, I don't want to lose this thing. I don't want to face this consequence. That's why, like, hey, tax returns, come on, like, we can fudge it a little bit. Like, we move things around because we're like, hey, I'm living for this part here, and we forget, listen, there is a long part of the rope that we're meant to be living for, and remember, we're going to be held accountable for the way we live our lives. What does it look like for us to keep our eyes so focused on God that we can't help but be caught up in his mission? And I share all this knowing that we can't do it alone. Like, that's the whole point of this conversation. We've been leading up to this, to the fact that, again, there is a gravity to our vision, and we fall down to this earth, and we look at the things that we shouldn't be looking at, things that don't last, and things that are bad investments. And my challenge to you is we can't do it alone. You and I were meant to live out in biblical community. That's not just Sunday morning. That's doing life together, walking out our faith side by side on mission for the King. That's what it looks like. And that's why life groups are going to be so important. Listen, our life groups this year, I know it's a shameless plug, our life groups this year are going to be a little different. And they're really geared towards us walking beside each other, reminding each other where we should be looking. And my challenge for you is, when we can look at the short part of the rope and we say, man, like that's extra time that it's going to take, and that's a sacrifice, and that's not something I want to do. Well, here's my challenge. What part of the rope are you looking at? Because if we are the disciples he has called us to be, then we need to be in an edifying body that is helping remind us, to lead us, to shepherd us closer to his presence. And that is exactly what our life groups are going to be for. We're going to have a moment where we get to respond in worship. And as we do that, I just want to remind you guys and actually challenge you to look into your hearts and wrestle through what are the things that I am focused on? What are the things that have been stealing my attention from the one who deserves it most? Would you pray with me? Jesus, we love you. We're grateful. We're grateful for this chance to wrestle together, grateful for this chance to listen to your call and listen to your voice as we gaze our eyes upon you, on the eternal, on the things that really matter. Lord, I just pray over everyone who is in the suffering right now, that your arms are wrapped around them, reminding them of what's most important. I pray that we are a body that comes around them as well. I pray that we are a people that is not caught up in grumbling, but is caught up in who you tell us we are. God, help us to be the disciples that you created us to be. We love you and we praise you. In your name, amen.